If you're a long time listener of the podcast, I'm sure you know that my mom has been with me for a while, and that's because my wife, Patience, was off in Washington, D.C., because she was getting some extra qualifications in finance, which comes in handy for her job as a government regulator, or rather, a regulator working with the government agency, and possible ideas that we have for businesses in the future. And so, Grandma, as the kids call her, Grandma Ben. So, Grandma Ben was around with us for close to a year, helping out until Patience got back. Patience is my wife. That's for those of you who are new time listeners. And yeah, so now that wifey is back, we've settled in, we've gotten back to our usual flow. It's time for Grandma to leave. And in fact, Grandma Ben left this morning. And so I figured I'd make a recording because there are a couple of conversations that we've had while she's been here. For those of you who don't live with your parents anymore, I'm sure you can appreciate what it is that I'm about to say. You run off to university and then you spend a lot of time in university. Each semester is about 3 or 4 months. And so basically, you spend all your time in uni, you come home for about 2 or 3 weeks, then you're back in uni again, and then maybe you're home for Christmas, well, at least for me anyway. But for my other siblings, my brother and my cousins, because my mom only has me and my brother, but we have the other girls who grew up with us that we call sisters, but they're actually my cousins. So my brother and my cousins, they had much more independent streaks, and so they spent even more time away from home because they wanted to be out with friends and stuff like that. So anyway, you get to spend very little time with your folks when you're growing up and you hit 18, independence years and all of that. And so as you grow a lot older, you start valuing the time that both of you have together. So now that I'm a parent and I have my own kids, every single time that we can spend together, like Momsy coming over because Patience wasn't around, or you head over, you go back home for the Easter period, or things like that. We've been spending a lot of time, we've been talking a lot, and we've been doing a lot of catching up. And one interesting thing I found was that there have been incidents and really formative things in my childhood that I thought were significant one way, but then only to discuss with my mom and then realize that things were not kind of what I thought them out to be. And that brings me to the topic of what I would like us to talk about today, and that's this thing called social capital. Now, social capital is something that is spoken about in American business and social circles, and sociology circles. And social capital, the idea behind social capital is this idea that there are learned skills or acquired skills that children soak up because of the environment that they're in. So it's pretty much a kind of osmosis thing. So you have situations where, if you remember from the knowledge management episode, there are these situations where children acquire explicit information because a teacher is telling them to learn the ABCs or one, two, threes and things like that. And basically, social capital is just all those other things that children learn just from the benefit of being in a certain environment. Now, the reason why social capital is one of those things that is discussed in American business and sociological circles is because I'm sure you guys have realized, well, for those of us who are Nigerians anyway, Nigerians or maybe Africans listening to this podcast, I'm sure you realize that the Americans are obsessed with this whole idea of nature versus nurture. What makes you what you are? Is it something genetic? Are you an entrepreneur because there's an entrepreneurial gene or there's a risk-taking gene? Or are you an entrepreneur because, your father was a businessman or your mom was a businessman or you grew up in those circles? So I've come across some research in America that seems to show that there's a genetic component, but that's mostly roughly about 30%. And then the other 60-70%, depends on the environment. So, in other words, yes, genetic factors might predispose you towards courage and risk taking and entrepreneurial behavior. But the most important thing is whether you were raised up in an environment, whether you actually did something with that streak or not. So even if you have the risk-taking gene, the entrepreneur gene, whatever it is, if you're not in the right environment, then things are not going to grow. So there's this idea of social capital, and then how does that tie into this long story that I've gone over so far concerning me and my mom? It's because we were having a conversation. Now that my mom is heading back home to Makudi, Makudi's in Benue State, she wants to get involved in an NGO because given circumstances that we grew up, because my mom and my father they had a rough marriage, and I'll spare you guys the details, but pretty much Momsy and the rest of us, the kids, all five of us, we had to be alone from around when I was about 12 or 13 years, and it was a pretty was a pretty rough period because it's not easy for a young mother, five kids, trying to uh, build a life, or rather to continue. What's the word? And it's not, but well, she was a young woman with five kids. And thinking about it now, I just realized that things must have been really rough because my mom was really young. I was born when my mom was 21 or probably 22. So, bottom line is, you have this young girl who is less than 35 years old with five kids who is trying to rough things out in Lagos. And, um, well, there's a period where she was unemployed for a bit. And, anyway, let's just say that there was a rough period before when we hit. By the time we hit university age, I mean gotten things had gotten relatively better, if you could put it that way. We had quite a bit of money. Mommy was now able to pay for a master's education abroad, and we had a pretty good life at a certain point. But in the beginning, it was kind of rough, and during that rough period, I didn't have a father around me or any other adult figure to look at per se, but just my mom, and looking at her push through life and rough things. Oh gosh, what's the expression? Forgive me. Anyway, so just watching her just trying to brave through everything kind of taught me a lot about courage, risk tolerance, being entrepreneurial, being bold, because there are times that we had to make she had to make ends meet, whether it's with a job or a business dealing here and there, because she told me about some of the business runs that she tried to do at the time, to get some extra money. Anyway, that's a conversation for another day. I mean, some of her failed business enterprises. So, from my own point of view, I was learning a lot about how to live by watching my mom being courageous, just her against the world. Um, it's not like things were really good with her own family anyway, because as we Niger people know, all families have issues. So her family was trying to be supportive the way that they could, and she was able to get loans from her brothers every now and then. But pretty much it was just her and the kids. Her and the kids alone, her and the five of us alone. So I watched her be brave. I watched her take risks, and I watched her be entrepreneurial in lots of things. And so for my brother and I think this thing just became second nature. As in, we saw our mother be a she wolf and just take life head on and just fight. And so for us, it was just second nature. That's what we grew up in. We didn't grow up in an atmosphere of fear. It was just this whole thing of we need to get shit done, so let's get going. And that's what my brother and I learned anyway. And so it was very inspiring for me, and I learned a lot just watching her. So anyway, now that Momsi is retired and she's thinking about what next to do with life, she wants to get involved in the NGO space and help young ladies in particular, because the way Momsi looks at things, life can be unnecessarily rough when you're a woman. And so I hooked up with a friend of mine who I met in the NGO space through my work with the British Council, and they got talking. And so when we finished the meeting, my mom made a statement that I thought was really interesting. So my mom said, "I am learning from you, my son." And of course, I asked her that, "What do you mean you're learning from me?" And she said, "Well, summary," she said, was, "Well, I'm watching you do this thing. You're being a wedding photographer. Now you're a sales consultant. I'm watching you do these things without being afraid, and I'm learning how to not be afraid anymore." And I asked her that. I was like, how can you learn from me? Because rather, I learned from you. And so she laughed and she said, what do you mean you learned from me? And I said, well, this whole thing about courage and being brave, and there's something that needs to do. Let's just do it. I learned my courage. I learned my lack of fear from watching you. And then she had a big laugh and she was like, what I did was not brave. And I'm like, no, mom, what you did was brave. And she said, no, that was not bravery. It was just how for do. Um, for those of you who are not Nigerians listening to this podcast, the idea behind how for do is like you're between a rock and a hard place. So like you're screwed any which way. So you might as well just get it on. And we had a good laugh over that because I thought my mom was brave, but for her, she didn't see it as being brave. For her, it was just, I'm between a rock and a hard place. Shit needs to be done. Let's get shit done. And that's just how she was looking at it. But I still maintain that there's bravery there because there are people who have been in situations that my mom was and it absolutely crushed them. So I still think my mom is brave. Even though she says she's not brave, she's very fearful, and she did what she had to do then just because shit needed to get done, and so we had to move. So, yeah, it was one of those conversations where we didn't have any clear resolution. I still maintain that I learned all these things from my mom, but my mom says no, she's fearful, and that she's learning bravery from watching me. So how does this tie into this whole thing about social capital? Sorry about this long story that I've gone on today. So how does this tie into this whole thing about social capital? There are lots of things that you do, and your kids, they're watching, they're learning. You might be moving out of an instinct of fear because you're trapped between a rock and a hard place. You don't know what the options are, but you put one foot forward and you keep going on. You think you're being fearful, but that little boy that you have there, that 12-year-old, he's watching. The 8-year-old kid, he's watching. The girls, they're watching and they're learning. They see mommy do stuff, they see daddy do some stuff, and they're learning. There's social capital all the time, and we just need to make sure that we're very deliberate about these sorts of things. And it's something that my mom did well, I think, because we would have conversations growing up. She built a career in public relations and marketing communications. Basically, she worked with different organizations within the Troika group. Troika is sort of like, should I say, Nigeria's foremost advertising group, kind of. It's headed by this fellow. It's owned by can't remember his name, Shobanjo. I think people call him the Tsar of advertising in Nigeria. He used to work with some fancy American firm back when they were still here. Was it a UK firm? And anyway, he set off on his own, and so he had Troika Holdings, and they had MC&A. That's marketing, communications, and advertising. There was Troika Group. There was Quadrant. So basically, different organizations built around public relations, advertising, marketing, communications, and what else. So she, had several stints in some of those organizations. And so during those times, we would talk about things, public relations, about marketing, about sales, about investing, about networking. Although, to be honest, my mom seemed to lean more to the marketing and networking type conversations. We didn't have a whole lot of sales conversations. But basically, from watching her examples and from the conversations that we would have at home and the books that she would leave lying around and the books that we would read and talk about and things like that, that's where I learned a lot of the things that are important to how I'm trying to grow my business today. So that's what social capital has to do with this long sub story that I've given you guys about my life so far. Basically, just to say that for those of you who have kids, the kids are watching. They're acquiring skills. They're acquiring attitudes. They're acquiring dispositions, and it's all happening through osmosis. And we have to be very deliberate about that. So for those of us who have kids, we need to talk to our kids, and it's something that I've started doing. My son is at that age. He's just above 6, and he has started asking those questions. What is a client? Who are your clients? I'd like to meet your clients. Why do you have clients? How do you keep clients? Why do we need money? What is money? How do we make more money? We've started having all those conversations, and this is going to be part of the social capital that hopefully is going to be important to him when he is now a 30 or 40-year-old man. There's going to be lots of things that he picked up, when he was a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 10, a 12-year-old, and so it's the same thing with the rest of us who have kids. So, as much as we're doing our best to build our careers and our businesses as wedding industry professionals, we also need to make sure that we are putting the right environment around their kids so that the bank of social capital that they have will set them off for a very good life. And I believe in particular that part of this environment that we need to put around our kids is this whole idea of you can achieve and you can do and you do not have to be fearful. Because right now, at the time of making this podcast in 2021, there's a lot of fear. People are unhappy with the government of Buhari. People think that we have northern hegemony going on. People are worried about corruption, all kinds of things. And now there's another wave coming around. Everybody running off to Canada. And we keep going through all these cycles. So when I was a kid, there was the great U.S. migration, with visa lottery and everything, and then on and on. The UK, and so now it's Canada. Who knows where else it's going to be? But please, let's make sure that we set the social capital right. Let's not let our children grow up in fear. Let's help them to realize that they can take personal responsibility for their lives, for their finances, for their families, and that they can achieve. So let's talk to our kids. Talk about sales. Talk about investing. Talk about networking. Talk about stuff, because the kids are learning and they're picking up loads of stuff, and this is going to be really helpful to determine what it is that they become in the future. And so this whole thing is divorced from whatever kind of genetics that we give them. So the genetic part is not up to you. Whatever your genes are, you've already given them. So their height has already been determined, their color, their complexion, whether they'll be good looking or not, whether they'll be fat or slim, that has been determined. The risk-taking gene, the whatever gene, all that is none of our business. All that has been determined. Let's take care of the nurture part and set our kids up well. And that's pretty much what today's monologue is about. Yeah, that's it. I'd like to apologize to you guys if I went on for too long about my whole, my whole family wahala, because I'm sure you guys didn't sign up to this podcast to listen to somebody moan and bitch about his life. But anyway, yeah, so that's it. Social capital. Yeah, so that's it pretty much. Social capital. Let's make sure that we set our kids up right. If you're fortunate, like I am, to have parents who are still alive, please spend some time with them, because this is I must admit, it's a really good, pleasing, it's a much more pleasant part of life, let me put it that way, when you can sit down with your parents and talk to them as peers, as other humans, and not as some authoritarian figures. Anyway, I've gone past the 20-minute mark. Thank you very much, guys, for listening to the Sales for the Nigerian Wedding Industry podcast. I'm your host, Abuja-based I'm your host, Abuja-based sales consultant and event media professional, Tabishima Ayede. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And don't worry, tomorrow's recording is going to be a lot shorter, and it's not going to be about any personal stuff. I'll head straight to the business things that we're supposed to talk about. And then to give you guys a heads up, for the session that I had with Kairos Real Estate on how to close the deal in real estate, I'm going to share the material that I came up with for them. So you guys should be very happy, because it was a paid session to run through their sales team, but you guys are going to be receiving some of that goodness here for free. So you guys should be grateful. Let's see. Oh yeah, so those are some of the things that are going to be lined up for the next couple of days. For the how to close the deal in real estate sales training that I did with Kairos Real Estate, that's the real estate firm that Dibanj is a partner in. For those of you who are Nigerians, for those of you who are not Nigerians, Dibanj was a huge, I think they call it Afro pop, or what's it called, Afro pop musician. Back in the day. And so he's branching out in other businesses. Real estate is one of them. So I had a training with the salespeople for his firm, and so I'll be sharing that with you guys. The session lasted, I think, about 3 hours, and I'm not going to make a 3 hour podcast recording. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it up into micro sessions where we discuss one little thing at a time. So, just like with the material that we did on professionalism, communications, and networking, where I just did several episodes that lasted, I think, close to 2 weeks or so, this is probably going to be one of those things. So that we don't have a 3 hour podcast recording, I'll probably spread it out. So, once we start on that, we'll probably have a marathon session of maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks where we run through some of the juicy ideas that we discussed. So, yeah, that's it. That's what you guys should look forward to for next week. But of course, even though it was tailored towards people in the real estate space, it still is relevant to those of us in the wedding space, in the event space, or whatever industry that you're involved in. So always remember, don't think that because it is sales for the Nigerian wedding industry that is not applicable to you because you work in investment banking. The principles apply. We just need to be a little bit smart and creative, take these principles and then apply them to our own situation. So thank you very much, guys, for listening. I'll catch you at the next recording.